everyone, welcome to another episode of the Autonomous Health Podcast. I'm your host, Anmol Madan, and with us today is Cody Simmons, CEO of DermaSensor. Welcome, Cody, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to speak today.
Yeah. So, Cody, before we dive in, we're going to talk about machine vision, your recent FDA approval, the overnight success that happened, and maybe or for a company that's been around for a very long time. But let's start by having you introduce yourself. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about the company, what you do, and what brought you to this current role.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll maybe work in a bit about myself and the company. So my background's in bioengineering and business. I went to Brown University undergrad, and they had a very interesting entrepreneurship program. And so I started off thinking I'd be a biomedical engineer, and did that for the first year or two, but had taken a couple entrepreneurship classes and economics classes. It's like, okay, the kind of business world seems interesting. I hadn't had any exposure to that where I'm from in Gainesville, Florida, kind of north central Florida. So started dabbling in that and realized after a couple of years, I'm like, okay, this is really where my passion and interest lies, and did a couple relevant internships and such. So I did, and you gotta love Brown, very flexible curriculum and whatnot. My thematic cluster was bioengineering. So I did the entrepreneurship program, the technical track, and kind of my theme was bioengineering. It's more kind of neuroengineering, but so I was thinking of kind of going straight into management consulting out of undergrad, and kind of get that business foundation. And my sister's a professor of biomechanical engineering, so kind of went the PhD route. She's like, but you don't know, you want to do kind of healthcare science stuff, but you don't know any science. I was like, what do you mean? I did my thematic cluster, and she's like, yeah, that doesn't mean anything. You like kind of did pre-med. No one's gonna care. Like if you actually want to better understand science and really understand, the challenges scientists go through, blah, blah, you should at least do a master's. So I, part out of interest and knowing that was kind of the area that I wanted to focus on, given the not just business opportunities, but also the impact to actually, in my opinion, kind of improve the world and better patient care, et cetera. I was like, okay, let me kind of dig into the science a bit more. So I did a bioengineering master's program. It was actually a Brown program, but it kind of was able to coordinate doing my thesis research at Stanford. So I was in a biomaterials lab there for a year. So yeah, really interesting work, but kind of knew long-term I wanted to do the kind of the more business developing and startup side of things. But being in the health tech life sciences world, I'm like, all right, I can't jump straight into that. And actually, I remember an entrepreneur friend of mine from undergrad is like, why are you going to work for Genentech? It's the largest pharma company in the world. Yeah. If you want to do startups. I'm like, well, you can't just like jump straight into startups in like biopharma and med tech, like you need tons of capital, it's super highly regulated. He's like, it's like, that's BS, man. Like that lady from Stanford, she didn't even graduate. You did a master's. That lady, Elizabeth Holmes, is like killing it. And she, at that company, Theranautic or whatever it is. And I was like, well, whatever. She's super talented. I don't know. Yeah. So I think ultimately, I think it was a good idea to have actually like spend a few years and, really see how top tier life science products are developed and commercialized, right? I mean, arguably there's no better company in the world at doing that than Genentech. And so I did a leadership development program there, got a lot of good experience in clinical operations, business development, commercial strategy. So did 4 6-month rotations, and then was in a commercial strategy group for 2 years before joining a mobile medical device screening and monitoring startup. And it was really focused on ophthalmic diseases, mainly DME and AMD. So yeah, I was doing that with, still in San Francisco. So it was coming up on 6 years at that point when I was introduced to, now to kind of connect the dots here to DermaSensor, introduced to Dr. Maurice Ferre, a very successful serial medical device entrepreneur and executive. Started off kind of training in orthopedic surgery, ended up pursuing an entrepreneurial career as well. His first company sold to GE. He was at GE for a while as I think a VP of business development, ended up leaving to get another company off the ground, which him and a now longtime business partner, Chris Dewey, started together called Mako Surgical. Mako ended up, 10 years later going public, selling to Stryker for 1.6 billion. So they were an early pioneer in the surgical robotics space. So Dr. Maurice Frey and Dr. Fred Moll, the co-founder of Intuitive Surgical and Aura Surgical, have known each other for a long time, kind of collaborate, sit on each other's boards on various, mostly surgical robotics type companies. So Maurice, Chris, and a couple other folks that they often work with on kind of making big early investments and starting companies together, got DermaSensor off the ground in 2009. So this technology was developed at Boston University, this type of non-invasive spectroscopy. And so that's where a lot of, in collaboration with them, some of the early proof of concept work happened. And ultimately, they did some early development work. And okay, we're kind of at the point, as Maurice put it when I was introduced to him, actually like exactly 8 years ago, we have an interesting research project and we're looking for someone to turn it into a company. And so that's really kind of when I got involved. I was 27 at the time. I had more hair and less gray hair. And I was, kind of a few years experience under my belt and was kind of excited to take that on, especially because my mom and my aunts are both melanoma survivors, fortunately early stage, so not a big deal in terms of treating it, but was appreciative of the importance of detecting it early, especially because I got my first biopsy when I was 15, growing up playing tennis in Florida. I've had, dozens of moles, since I guess my teenage years.
And Cody, that's really helpful, and that's a great introduction. And walk me through. There's something special about how you guys are thinking about imaging here, and you mentioned non-invasive spectroscopy. So I think if you can take a minute and talk about why that's different, because a lot of machine vision applications that we see, AI, machine vision for healthcare tend to be using the smartphone camera. And your approach is a little bit different. So talk about that thinking and what brought you there, and why does that work better, or how does it compare to the status quo?
Yeah, sure. No, great question, and I get that one a fair amount, as you can imagine. So, the first paper, we actually looked at this recently. The first paper on applying algorithms or software of some sort to photos of skin lesions
Yeah.
was published 34 years ago, 1980. Anyway, so it's I think 89. So there's been a lot of excitement around that. I mean, it's definitely one of the earliest, like, back when AI was computer vision, and
Yeah.
I don't know what the
And
hell.
by the way, interesting historical point there, but like the mid 80s was when a lot of the face recognition, the older
Oh, there you go.
generation face recognition stuff was
Yeah.
working. And my sense is there was probably an
So
active
it's an
interest
early
in,
kind of area of interest.
yeah.
I'm not an imaging expert, so we use a type of optical spectroscopy. So we're taking kind of these non-invasive optical tissue samples using this fiber optic probe tip. So it's one-dimensional data. It's pulsing hundreds of different wavelengths of light, and so probably I guess millions of photons
Yeah.
at all these different wavelengths, measuring how much scatters back to the spectrometer, assessing things like nucleus size, melanocyte density, some of the same things a pathologist would look at under a microscope. I don't know a lot about imaging, but I do know there's been hundreds of, I mean, if not thousands of researchers and dozens of companies that have tried to develop what we've developed for literally decades, and there's not a single one available on the market right now in the US. There's challenges, everywhere from image standardization like lighting and distance, and what if it's a darker skin patient? What if
And
there's
just to
hair in the way?
clarify that point, when you say there's, so what you're saying is there's hundreds of projects or researchers using smartphone cameras to go after this problem, and that hasn't
Not
really
only
worked.
just smartphone, but like
Okay.
also standalone. They're called dermoscopy images. So
Okay.
it's kind of like enhanced. It's basically a polarized magnifying glass. And there's so many. There's actually a competition that Memorial Sloan Kettering hosts every year. It's called the ISIC competition. I think the last year we saw there was like 400 groups that submitted an algorithm, right? So they basically like, oh, who's got the best like skin classification algorithm? So like I think it's really promising academically, but none of the company, and I won't name names, there's been
Yeah.
multiple that have
Yeah.
either been commercial abroad or one that failed a pivotal study a year and a half ago here in the US, that have just not been able to turn
And
the corner.
is the underlying thesis that there just isn't enough signal in an image
From
to identify, and were you able to get
Yeah,
into
I'm
a
not.
much
I think
richer picture?
there's a couple of issues. One is like surface level data. It's like garbage in, garbage out. Like if you're just assessing the visual appearance, at best you could really do as good as a doctor, because you're not assessing any data that's more enhanced than what they can already see. So that's why there's some approaches like dermoscopy and others like, okay, can you get kind of visualize other structures? But I think image standardization is a major issue. Like what kind of cameras are you using, lighting, distance, skin color, is there hair in the way? Like I remember one paper that looked really promising. There was some follow-up statement. There was like, it was like, yeah, the algorithm was picking up on, is there marker in the photo? Because the markers, you use marking pens on lesions before you do a biopsy. So like the algorithm figured out the marking pen means the doctor thinks it's suspicious. So like, I think there's just lots of challenges with like, yeah, it sounds good in theory,
Yeah.
but literally for decades now, when companies make attempts to actually do robust prospective multi-site studies, Memorial Sloan Kettering just published a paper like a year ago. They downloaded available online. I think some on website, some on the App Store. There's over 25 software programs. Most were in Europe, some kind of illegally on the App Store in the US. For melanoma assessment, the average sensitivity for melanoma was 28%. And like these are available like for patients. It was mostly patient use for patients to download and like take a photo of themselves. So, I mean, honestly, pretty scary. I mean, a lot of these could just, are killing people
And
according
so
to
that's an interesting. And how much of your, when you think of your unique, and so you're obviously, the hope is you're finding, much richer signal using spectroscopy. Is this part of the miniaturization of the sensing and the ability to kind of lead this? Is this like, how has that technology access been moving along since like 2009 to
yeah.
2024?
As I'd say, I could share a slide, but I don't know how that works on podcast. But yeah, I'll paint a visual.
Yeah.
So what I inherited was literally a 30-pound microwave sized device. Um, I was like really hard to like carry, and so that's what we built with BU. And so the main kind of focus, which the lofty ambition, like, oh, this should take 6 to 12 months. But I started hearing like the engineers. I'm like, so I told the board, I'm like, guys, I don't think this is like a 1 year project. It ended up being 3.5. So that was, I'd say, frankly, the first major like business setback is that the device, taking it from a microwave sized device to this was way more costly and intensive than we'd hoped. Um, there's also some technical changes we made. We were originally thinking of using a discrete wavelength spectrometer that just pulses a few wavelengths of light, but we ended up deciding let's just we found a miniaturized xenon lamp that was still broadband light source. We're like, all right, screw it. So that we lost a year just kind of like pursuing the wrong technical approach. Um, but anyway, so yeah, no, that was a long path, and honestly, part of our thinking at the outset, and I'm very very grateful to some of the early movers in the space like Melifine and Nevisense, because I think they really had a lot of challenges learning uh, with kind of commercializing those to dermatologists, because investors and a lot of the physicians you work with on this are dermatologists, like they're the experts, they know the space well, and they always want tools for themselves, right, to like help
Yeah.
specialists get better. But our main thesis from a population health standpoint is like, well, dermatologists are pretty good at assessing skin, and sure, everyone can get better at what they do, but what about the 300,000 PCPs that pretty much every single day are asked by at least one patient, hey, what do you think about this mole? Should I go
Yeah.
see a dermatologist? Like literature shows that's where all the cancers are being missed. That's where 30 to 50 referrals are being done for every one melanoma, right? So if you can upskill the generalist
Yeah.
to a level more comparable to the specialist, that's where a lot of value is added. And then,
Yeah.
we didn't invent
No,
that
I
concept
love the
overnight.
story. I love the story, and I think for two parts. I think the generalist, or the empowering the PCP. That's a pretty common thread we're seeing across a lot of healthcare
Exactly.
conversations. And so we've had, even folks in this podcast come in, experts in mental health, talk about how so much of mental health is being done at the psychiatry layer, but needs to move into primary care. Early detection, better support, and so I think that is a common thread across a number of diseases and conditions. Certainly, cancers here. And then the other piece I love about your story is, I think I say this as a technologist who's sort of very excited about, I've spent my career in machine learning and for AI and healthcare, for AI, for healthcare. And so we tend to get super excited about what the things can do, but we don't realize that there may be our natural limits because the signals just aren't rich enough. And until you had miniaturization of a new kind of sensing technology that you could embed it on phones at a reasonable price point, like a lot of the stuff that you were describing was just not possible. Doesn't matter how many megapixels or whatever the latest iPhone cameras are.
Yeah.
And so that's a really fascinating kind of insight from this discussion. So keeping us moving, all right, so
Sure.
you've got this incredible technology, and then January was a big month for you guys, right? And so
Yeah.
you got FDA approval, and not only FDA approval, but it sounds like you guys have been picked up all over the media. You're covered by a bunch of popular press and articles and talking about why this is important. So talk to us about that. So what happened? Why is it meaningful? Obviously for the company, but also why is it meaningful for the space of skin cancers, and what this means for people either at risk or trying to manage some of those conditions.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for our space specifically, yeah, I mean, quite a long process. We spent about $25 million on R&D, and only a few million of that was for the hardware kind of development and miniaturization. So the lion's share, I'd say about 20 million, was just for clinical research. So we've done about 13 clinical studies in total. Six were submitted to the FDA, and so it's a combination of like validation studies showing like standalone device performance. How does that compare to doctors? And some studies have been for regulatory authorities in Europe that uh, under the old, it's complicated, but MDD, the prior regulations kind of weren't as intense as the new ones, MDR, and as the FDA is. So we kind of used early pilot studies for the European CE mark, and also helped get more information and kind of de-risk the major studies we did for the FDA. So the big ones we submitted to FDA that were kind of the basis for approval, first and foremost, was the pivotal study with 22 primary care study centers. Mayo Clinic led that, and it showed the device performance head to head against PCPs was stronger, and that also what was very interesting was basically the device gives a 0 to 10 scale. We don't, it's not 0 to 100. Actually, we brought that up with the FDA at one point because PCPs could confuse that with percent likelihood. But what was great coming out of the pivotal study with over 1,000 patients, around 1,600 lesions, and over 200 skin cancers, was it showed the 0 to 10 scale was a clear statistically meaningful increase in cancer likelihood. So, for example, for a negative result, the negative predictive value is 97% for across all three common skin cancers. And so that's what actually, to take a step back, there's, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 what we think of as like meaningful firsts that our clearance achieved. And I think any product, like, when you get clearance, it's typically some kind of first, right? Maybe it's the first with this specific technology, or like, in our case, like, oh, it's the first like point and click skin cancer detection device, or, but so we have like 3 or 4 of those, but we have a couple like major, so the first automated skin cancer device of any kind for use by non-dermatologists, because there's been 2 that have been approved before just for dermatologist use and just for melanoma. So our device specifically is for physicians who are not specialists, because the idea is like, well, if you're already expert level, specialist, like our device, we've done some studies in the dermatology setting and shown the device performance is strong there, but does it necessarily benefit a specialist? We didn't even bother trying to really evaluate that, because we're focused on, can it benefit a generalist? And so the big melanoma study we submitted to FDA with 10 melanoma study centers, Dana-Farber at Harvard led that, showed that the device accuracy was on par with dermatologists. And so that plus the pivotal study showing the device performance is better than PCPs, I think was an important kind of 1-2 combo, showing, okay, not only device performed very strong for melanoma, a large number in the derm setting, on par with these dermatologist skin cancer experts, but also head to head for all skin cancers and PCPs, the device outperformed them. And this scale, the 1 to 10 scale, showed a score of 1 was a 6% chance of cancer, a score of 10 was a 61% chance. So literally a tenfold increase in cancer likelihood from a low to a high score. So like that, if you're a clinician and you can pick up our device and within 30 seconds have again, it's not an exact percentage because every doctor, patient population, and prevalence is different, but you can have a very meaningful relative risk result that's very helpful in terms of, do I refer the patient or not, right? Which is really the decision that most of America's
And Cody,
300,000
just to take
PCPs
that
are
one
making.
step forward, and so you spoke a lot about the specialist versus primary care. Is there an end consumer product here? Like, does this become like, I'm just kind of like trying to understand where does this curve go? And maybe you're like, that's 5 years away. Don't even ask me that question.
Yeah,
But like,
yeah.
is this like, does this end up in people's like homes?
Um, not with how you think. I
Okay.
think there's, or at least not. I mean, maybe in our
Elaborate.
lifetime, but
Yeah.
not in this decade. Um, I mean, maybe if there's like drastic changes in policy or like the review team at the FDA, but they did a year and a half ago a panel meeting on skin lesion analyzers was kind of the idea because there's so much interest in this space. And the whole panel, and I think, the FDA was aligned with that, is like, how can patients self-evaluate moles? Because like you may be worried about this mole in your forearm and you literally have melanoma on your shoulder and like you think you're fine, but and melanoma can progress as quickly as 2 weeks to like higher mortality rates. So I don't honestly, I don't think at any point soon patients kind of self-use, oh, help me evaluate my suspicious lesions, unless, and this is where I was going, unless it's under physician supervision of some sort, right? So if a physician's like, hey, we have an app or we have this device, I'm going to prescribe it to you to basically monitor like these 3 or 4 lesions, or, it's approved for you and companion use. If you guys see any new mole that's greater than, the size of a pencil eraser, that's like the risk is like 6 millimeters, then, photograph it or scan it. So then I can consider whether to bring you back in early. So I think in that way, there could be patient home
But
use.
isn't that just an interaction with telemedicine? Like, couldn't that provider just be in
Pretty
like,
much. Yeah, pretty much. But it could be AI assisted. Like you can imagine maybe it's like, okay, well, like the physician use algorithm, I'm going to set the algorithm so that, it's super high sensitivity. And even with that, if it says no risk, I'm not going to bother having to review it. Right.
very
So it's
cool.
kind of like,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of this messy, like, is it really patient? It's not patient standalone use. I can say that. Right.
Yeah. So, Cody, we spoke a lot about what you guys are doing at DermaSensor specifically, but I want to pivot and hear your thoughts. I mean, you spent a decade plus on this problem across various roles. DermaSensor itself has been around for almost 15 years. What's your take on what's happening with machine vision in the broader landscape? Right. And I
Sure.
think we were chatting about this earlier, but the FDA, I think, is approved at this point over 500 AI algorithms.
Wow.
As
Yeah,
far
that's
as I
incredible.
can tell, most of them are imaging related or radiology related. There's a lot of things there that are probably like just optimizing or cleaning up kind of image data and not really making clinical diagnosis or clinical
Yeah.
decisions or recommendations. So what's your overall like view of the landscape? What's happening in that space from your lens that is exciting? What do you think are some of the places where people are a little too excited and it's too early for that? Would love your thoughts at the higher level.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll start outside of skin and then maybe I'll give a couple comments in the world I know best. I think, generally it's funny. I feel like a couple years ago, all of a sudden I became like, we thought we were like the cool kids. It was like, oh, predictive AI and spectroscopy. And then all of a sudden Gen AI came. It's like, oh, we're not like the hot new thing anymore. But no, I think Gen AI, when it comes to clinician burnout, could be immensely helpful. I mean, just like all the note taking documentation purposes, especially for billing and like prior authorizations and stuff,
Yeah.
just seems like an absolute nightmare and is really just like killing our clinical workforce. And I just hurting the country. So yeah, like pointing fingers between payers and provide, I don't feel I know enough to really like get in the mix on all that stuff, but I know it's a major issue for
Yeah,
HCV
well,
right now.
let me ask my question more specifically, right? So
Oh,
there's
sure.
all the broad AI applications, Gen AI,
Okay.
personalization, all of that's great.
But
But where
machine
do you see
vision
machine
specifically.
vision going? Where do
Oh,
you
got it.
see a
Okay.
lot of like
Sorry.
cameras,
I thought
sensing?
AI. I was thinking AI, not machine
Yeah,
vision.
no, it's not just you. I think the whole world is in that that realm. Is anytime you hear
Well,
AI, they start talking about
well,
LLMs.
machine
It's
vision. Actually,
yeah,
can I tweak that to machine learning? Because we don't actually use vision. We're not
sure,
taking images.
sure, yeah,
But yeah, so I'll use that one example that, like us, isn't using images is Echo Health. So applying AI ML uh, to stethoscope, to electrocardiogram, EKGs, ECGs, etc. I think is really interesting. I mean, Echo. I think their first clearance was maybe 6, 7 years ago, and I actually got Jason Bellett involved. He's been one of our advisors. He's a co-founder of Echo Health. I mean, they have a few cleared indications, so they're part of that 500 you mentioned. Um, and so, yeah, I think they're doing really interesting things. And again, same idea there, bringing like cardiologist level interpretation of primary care. I think there's 3 or 4. There's at least 3. I personally know 3, like leadership at 3 of the automated AI fundus imaging companies. Right, same thing, ophthalmologist level assessment of your retina
yeah,
at the point of care. And even those with like you only have 2 eyeballs. You don't have potentially dozens of them, like skin lesions. 2 eyeballs, your head's like in this camera, and even their imaging has challenges. I've heard that as many as 20, 30% of like patients that are, undergo the procedure don't get a test result because they blinked or they moved their head or something. So just imagine trying to do that on an arm or a chest or whatnot. So, but I think,
and maybe as you're describing this, I wonder if some of the imaging challenges are, in radiology because there's like standard machines and doing standard assessments. It's all kind of going through that particular GE, whatever
And,
setup.
and that's where I was going next. Yeah, my,
Yeah,
my impression, I don't know too much about the radiology space, but I think when I last checked, it was like a year and a half, 2 years ago, there was over 100. There's probably 200 plus at this point. I don't think many of them. So AMA came out with these new guidelines, assistive, augmentative, and autonomous. My impression is radiology is mostly assistive, and I think, like you were saying, some of those image capture ones, like, oh, it helps with ultrasound image capture, or I know Stanford and some other groups are doing helping capture higher quality skin lesion images, right? So I think those are more assistive, kind of like help guide and photo capture or whatnot. And also, radiology is a perfect example. It's not giving any quantitative like risk assessment, but it's like highlighting areas that may be concerning, right? So I
yeah,
think those are assistive. AMA defines augmentative, which we are, as like there's some kind of actually quantitative like results,
yeah,
but it's not replacing the physician decision making. That's the key piece. Yes, it's quantitative, like our 0 to 10 scale, but that's not replacing the judgment of the doctor. That last one is autonomous, and I think the only ones are in the fundus field. I don't think I'm aware of any that have been
yeah.
autonomous
Well,
outside of
there's a reason why we call this the Autonomous Health Podcast, right? It's because
it. Yeah,
I
exactly.
think like that's a world we're going to live in a few maybe years or
Yeah,
decades,
I
right?
think we'll get there. No, and
Yeah.
when I first saw the title, I was like, oh, interesting. Well, he definitely knows the fundus AI world well.
Yeah. So,
But
and then Cody, any parting thoughts for our audience? Any predictions about the future or things you feel people need to hear?
yeah, I mean, so tying it back to the skin side of things, I don't know if autonomous is going to happen. I think the FDA kind of views autonomous for skin cancer the same as patient use, because kind of what's the difference between a patient or an MA, or maybe there's something like, oh, a lesion identified as concerning by a physician, then you use the tool, the algorithm, and then do whatever the algorithm says. Like maybe that makes sense, but I mean that's not like an MA can't come in and do it all themselves, right? I do think there's some interesting synergies. We've talked to a couple companies that do machine vision using total body photography. So they kind of, that's kind of the standard of care for monitoring. Is basically you take images of the whole body, you kind of strip down and get images everywhere. And the idea is to do that every few months so you can see are any lesions new or changing. And so there's some software out there that'll kind of use algorithms to automatically flag like outliers, like, oh, this one seems changing shape or this one seems new. So you can imagine eventually maybe a future where, okay, there's something like that, that audit, an MA could do, or maybe a patient at home even, that like flags what's new or changing. And then you use a point assessment, a lesion assessment tool like ours to determine, okay, but like, is that actually a risky lesion? Because a lot of benign lesions change all the time too. So, just because something's changing doesn't mean it's cancerous. There's tons of benign lesions that come and go and get larger, etc. So I think in our world, I think that, and what I spoke to earlier, kind of patient at home use and a prescription use, I think those are the things that realistically could be here in 5 to 20 years. That may sound like a long time, but just knowing the development process, I laugh. Sometimes we talk to like companies in the space, and I always get a kick out of like, yeah, we expect clearance next year. I'm like, oh, great. So you wrapped up your pivotal study. Like, well, no, we haven't started enrolling yet. I'm like, absolutely no way you're gonna get it approved within a year and a half or 2 years if you haven't even started enrolling yet. Some of the stuff I've seen in investor decks is pretty laughable.
This is awesome. Well, this has been an incredible conversation. You've been listening to Cody Simmons, CEO at DermaSensor. Cody, thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Anwar Madan from the Autonomous Health Podcast. So thanks again.